Hello, this is Dr. Z. I'm going to take you through the major concepts of the Italian Renaissance. So, we have here the creation of Adam by Michelangelo, and this is on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And you see God on the right, pointing his finger towards Michelangelo's depiction of the biblical Adam on the left. And from the Bible, it says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them." What we are going to learn about today is humanism and some of the other major concepts of the Renaissance, but that's really the big one. We're going to learn why people are so special, both in the secular view and read scientific, right? And in the Christian religious context as well. The ancient Greeks thought about why people were so special. The Romans did as well. People can do all sorts of things that other animals can't. So it's not a large intellectual stretch to think that God created people in his own image. And we'll talk about all the different sort of ways of thinking about that as we move forward. So there'll be two parts to the Renaissance. This is part one, which is the major concepts. Part two will be focused on the art. The Renaissance itself means rebirth. Okay, so it comes after the Middle Ages. And a rebirth of what? Classical culture. Classical meaning ancient Greek, ancient Roman. So texts, art, architecture, values, governance systems, all of that gets sort of reborn in Europe after the Middle Ages. A lot of historians think it's really sort of a continuation of the Middle Ages and Middle Age thought and what we learned about the Middle Ages in class. I think you'll probably agree. But it's also a bit of a turning point, and there's some newer ideas that we'll talk about. So before the Renaissance was the Middle Ages, also known as the medieval era. Okay. Middle because, as Petrarch, who's a Renaissance person, said, it's between ancient Rome and the Renaissance. Okay, so it's a very Italian way of thinking about history, but that's the dominant way of creating the timeline as we know it. So we said it was a rebirth of classical ideas. We also see city-states emerging as intellectual and artistic centers. And I've got a map of those for you in a couple slides later. We also see the beauty of nature, the dignity of mankind, this idea of humanism, which we'll talk a little bit more about what that really means. It's also a period of artistic and intellectual creation, as was the classical era. And who's paying for a lot of this? It's the Catholic popes and wealthy families in those Renaissance city-states. So causes of the Renaissance are pretty diverse. A big one, a lot of people point to the Crusades as a time when Europeans went to the Middle East, waged religious war there, but when they came back, they pillaged and they pillaged the Middle East and they brought back a lot of texts, knowledge. The Middle Ages in the Middle East was a flourishing golden age with lots of knowledge, science, literacy. And so, one sort of interpretation is that these knowledge-starved crusaders found all these wondrous things about European culture that they were learning about in the Middle East, and they brought them back. Ancient Greek and Roman texts, things like that. Another is that trade. There was more cross-cultural trade happening in the 12 and 1300s. So ports in Italy were thriving economically. There was lots of contact with outsiders who had far more advanced, more interesting cultures perhaps than the Europeans did at that time. And all of this learning is expedited by the printing press. So one of the questions we'll ask in class is, was the Renaissance really an extension of the medieval era, or was it a break from it? That's for you to decide. Where did it happen? There's three places you should think about with the Renaissance. The center in the beginning is Florence, Italy. If you ever get a chance to go to Florence, it's a beautiful city. It is filled with Renaissance art and architecture. The High Renaissance happens in Rome, Italy. High because it's paid for primarily by the popes in the Vatican. Okay, so this is the Vatican in Rome. And this, the High Renaissance is really sort of characterized with that. In the Florentine Renaissance, it's paid for mainly by the large families, particularly the Medici family, who, supports all of the artists as patrons. The Renaissance also migrates into Northern Europe, particularly into the Netherlands. And so the Dutch have their own Renaissance, and their art is particular, and we'll look at a little bit of that as well. So the big concept really in the Renaissance is humanism. Okay, I've got a key concept up there. That's right from the AP Gods for you. Humanism is really the idea that people are important. Okay, so in the Renaissance, secularism, which means not being religious, being secular, and individualism, the fact that like one person can really make a difference instead of like, favoring the group. Those were newer values that were emerging at the time. There was a man named Petrarch. We'll talk a little bit more about him. He proposed a new kind of education to recapture the glory of the Roman Republic. Young people studied classical Roman texts, used them as models to try to write clearly, argue effectively, speak persuasively. And you see in this painting here, okay, from left to right, we've got Dante Alighieri here, who wrote the Divine Comedy, one of the first pieces of literature in the vernacular. Giovanni Boccaccio, also a late medieval writer, wonderful author of the Decameron. And here is Petrarch right here, okay, along with some other Renaissance figures. And what are they doing? They're looking at the world, they're looking at math and science, and they're reading. The Latin classics became liberal arts or the humanities. This is where you get, in a few years, you'll be going off to college. This is where the idea of the liberal arts and the humanities comes from. And therefore, people who advocated for this kind of study to real learning were called humanists. So humanism is the philosophy that human nature and human achievements evident in the classics are worthy of contemplation. That's one definition. You will find many different definitions of humanism, right? We looked at Michelangelo's idea here in the beginning, right? Also humanist, right? Why in the world are humans created in the in the shape of God? That's another very sort of humanist question to have. Part 2 is going to have a lot of visual art, which is incredibly humanist. So this will be something that we'll be learning about for a number of days. And Britannica Kids, I put a link there for you, has a really good, easy to read page on humanism. So with all of this is a shift back to the classical. And your key concept outline wants you to understand that humanist revival of these ancient texts spread with the printing press. And we're going to talk about what that is. These texts challenged institutional power of universities, which were mainly religious at the time, theological seminaries, things like that. And of course, the power of the Catholic Church. So education moves from religious education towards classical education, studying Greek and Latin. And this is all helped by the printing press. And of course, this is a Roman frieze with Romans teaching and learning, right? So, these kind of scenes will start to look more familiar with the Renaissance. Here's a print of what the printing press would have looked like. So it's not one man in a shop, it's a group effort. They used what was called movable type. So you could see this worker here kind of moving around these, I think they were iron plates. I'm not sure exactly what they were made out of, but they're kind of like a stamp, what you would think of as a stamp today. And they moved the letters around. So they had to write every word with these iron stamps. And then once they got that all set on the plate, they would put it on this big machine and press it down. And there would be ink on the stamps, and it would stamp the paper. Paper was a lot cheaper and more available in this time period, which also helped the production of this. But this enabled all sorts of things. And Khan Academy has a really good website on the printing press. I've got a link for you there. But they say about the printing press was arguably one of the most revolutionary inventions in the history of the modern world. Gutenberg's heralded for his creation of a mechanical printing press that allowed for mass production of both images and text. And that's important. So movable type for the text, right? But also images. So you could reproduce art. You could reproduce what someone looks like. A picture's worth 1,000 words. You can teach a lot of people with images, right? So it's a very powerful thing. This movable type was first pioneered in East Asia, okay, and it came to Europe by way of the Silk Road. And in the 13th century, that's the 1200s, so this is when Europeans started working with the printing press. So it was portable, it was affordable, and affordable paper, as I said, contributed to that. And if you keep reading, it will talk about how really this is sort of the new mass media, right? So in a pre-digital age, like a lot of people compare the printing press to the internet. And that's a great question for us to discuss when we come together. The next concept is civic humanism. So this is the idea, right? Again, Greek and Romans have a wonderful culture. They have wonderful political institutions. We know Greeks invented democracy. The Romans had the Republic, right? So this revival of civic humanist culture, right, where people are involved in their everyday activities in their cities, right? That people are involved, like government doesn't just happen behind closed doors. It involves lots of different players. So a humanist city-state wanted to have, in the Renaissance, wanted to have a preference for active life, right? So you weren't supposed to just sit around and read all day like monks did in a monastery. You were supposed to like read and then put it into practice, right? Theory and practice together. Importance of vernacular writings. Vernacular is the spoken language, right? So the vernacular of Italy would be Italian, whereas the written language tended to be Latin, right? But people didn't run around in the 1500s speaking Latin. They spoke Italian. So let's have some literature in Italian. And Dante and Boccaccio were two of the first people to produce literature in Italian. And then the importance of a political liberty and the supremacy of Republican, and that means the republic. It doesn't mean Republican like in today's American political culture. It means a republic, meaning like the government we have in the United States, the government that they had in the beginnings of ancient Rome, and that type of representative government is more useful than a monarchy. An example of a Renaissance thought, right, comes from a very famous person named Machiavelli. Okay, and I'll let you read this on your own, and we'll talk more in class about what it means. So you can pause here. Machiavelli can certainly be compared to Baldassare Castiglione. These two books are often kind of compared to each other in the Renaissance, and your AP guides want you to be able to talk about both of them. So pause here, take a look at it, take some notes, and then we'll discuss in class how similar or different both of these books are. Another Renaissance humanist was Leonardo Bruni. He is considered one of the first historians in the Renaissance. He's certainly not the first historian in the world. There's plenty of people in the ancient world who write histories. But he wrote a history of Florence as a humanist city, and he said that the decline of Latin language after which happened at the end of the Roman Empire, led to the decline of the Roman Empire. That people were speaking all sorts of different languages and starting to, Rome was getting too diverse. Therefore, right, then that led to the fall of Rome. That's not a popular thought today, but this is one of the arguments that he made. Therefore, starting an idea of historiography, right? The idea that people can make arguments in history that are supported by historical evidence. He said, after the liberty of the Roman people had been lost through the rule of the emperors, the flourishing condition of studies of letters perished together with the welfare of the city of Rome. This is a very common way of looking at the fall of Rome and the rise of medieval Europe. Medieval Europe people tend to think that it was a time of lots of illiteracy, for example. He also divided history into 3 eras: ancient, medieval, and modern, which guess what? We do that today. So we have him to credit for that. Christian humanism. So humanism also has a Christian form. And I'm realizing that I'm running a little bit out of time, and I've got a few more slides. So I'm going to pause here and we'll do a part A and part B. So this was part A. Stay tuned for part B.